I'm Ashley Rosen, the email marketing coordinator, and today I'm joined by special guest Michelle Icard, author of 14 Talks by Age 14, for a breakdown of essential conversations to have with your tweens and teens to prepare them for any challenges they might face this year. You will learn Michelle's formula for having hard-hitting conversations with your kids, from knowing when to broach a sensitive subject to cultivating a relationship of openness and honesty. Before we start, we're just going to go over a couple guidelines. Now, this video event will be recorded. You will not appear in the video. Your audio will be muted during the event. You could submit your questions to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and closed captioning is available to turn on. Click on the live transcript option at the bottom of your screen and select your preference. We're going to have a short introduction, then we'll have a fireside chat with Michelle, and then the last 15 minutes of today will be a Q&A session, and we'll wrap up today around 4 p.m. So this is Michelle Icard. She is a speaker, author, and educator who helps kids, parents, and teachers navigate the complicated social world of early adolescence. Her latest book, 14 Talks by Age 14, guides readers through 14 essential conversations parents need to have with their kids before they start high school. She is currently writing her third book for Penguin Random House, 8 Failures That Can Make Your Child a Success. Michelle is a CNN parenting writer and a member of the Today Show's parenting team. Her work has been featured in the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, CNN, Time, and People magazine. Thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us today.
Ashley, thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So let's start talking about your book,
Yeah.
14 Talks That Are Essential to Have with Your Children. What are the 14 talks that are essential?
Yeah, so there's a pretty big range. 14 is a lot. It's not all the talks that we need to be having, but I'm really sort of progressing throughout the book, starting with relationship development, because the really tricky thing about talking to kids when they're in middle school is that they're at an age, so starting around age 11, they're at an age when we have a lot of valuable knowledge. We need to tell them the world is getting bigger. They're getting exposed to more things. So we really want to talk and they really don't want to listen. So the intro conversations in the book are really about sort of reframing how you talk together at an age when your kids are pulling away. And then it goes through, fun topics like, how do you retain your creativity when you are a tween? And I know parents are worried, oh, my kid just looks at a phone or a screen all the time. So that, to hygiene, to friendship issues, to money. I mean, there's a huge gamut of all 14.
Amazing. When do you feel is a great time to start, having some of these conversations? Is an age too young, too old? Is there anything that you find in their personalities that help gauge when's the perfect time?
That is such a good question. And the answer is nuanced in the sense that what you just said, what you find in their personality really will guide you. Some kids are very curious and they'll bring topics to you, and others won't. They're a little bit more private. So in general, my advice is don't wait for these topics to hit your radar. If your child is bringing it up, chances are they've been thinking about this for a while already. By the time your kid is 11, anything that's in this book, I want you to be talking about. And I'm including the hard-hitting topics in here, like pornography and suicide and drinking, like all of that stuff is totally appropriate to talk about to kids who are a younger age. There's even research that is firmly supported that kids as young as 3rd grade can have open conversations about the hardest of topics, which I think is suicide. And it's not going to plant any ideas in their head. It comes as a comfort to them to know that they can talk to you about these really hard things. So I would say beginning at around age 8 and 9, you can start dipping your toe in the water, but by 11, fully launch.
And for these earlier ages, are there resources or any guidance that you would have on like oversharing, or, knowing when to toe the line of some of these serious topics. Are we sharing too much? Are we, manipulating their minds a little bit to see it one way?
You can be. So I think that's really smart. You want to be cautious. Pardon me. I knew this was going to happen. I told Ashley ahead of time, you guys, I'm losing my voice this week. I don't know why, if it's allergies, but let me get a sip of water. It won't be like this the whole time. So you want to be careful that you're not oversharing, because what's happening with your child developmentally is that they are going through a process called individuating. They are starting to figure out who they are apart from you. And the more you tether what they're going through to what you've been through, the more they resist, because they're at an age in early adolescence, even before you really think adolescence begins. So 10, 11, they're at an age where they are beginning to feel a developmental urge. It's nothing against you, but an urge to separate. And that's really good. You want them to grow up and live outside of your house one day and be independent. So when you tie topics to your own experience, it can be informative or it can be confusing. My advice for this is to ask permission. So mostly what you want to be doing is really listening and taking in information. Obviously, we want to be giving advice and guidance too, but that's built on being a good listener. And then you can say, I've had a similar experience. Would you like me to share it with you? Or are you interested in hearing about a time that I went through something similar, and see if it's helpful to you? And your kid will tell you. They'll say yes or no, or no, I've got this. I don't, and you can give them an out. You can say, think about it, come back to me later if you want to hear more.
So you mentioned in your book, the brief model approach to conversations. Can you break this down for us?
Yes. So brief is an acronym. Each letter, BRIEF, stands for a different step. I love that it spells out the word brief, because I do want these conversations to be quick. Your child is much more likely to talk to you about even big, heavy, serious things if they know they can get in and get out. If they're like, oh, I want to ask my mom or my dad about this, but I don't have an hour. I just need some key information. So brief is 5 quick steps that I want you to take that really reframe the way that you communicate with your child. B is begin peacefully. A lot of times we think, my kid's only going to pay attention to me for a short time before they start, their eyes glaze over, or they pick up their phone or whatever. And so parents jump into the deep end thinking that's the only time they have. That's not a way of beginning peacefully. What I'd rather see you do is take a deep breath and start with a gentle conversation opener, not even tied to the main thing you want to talk about. Another nice way to do this is to arrange a time to talk. So kids their brains are pretty crowded, and they can feel a little bit caught off guard and unprepared if you're just like, hey, I want to talk to you about drinking. And they're like, where did this come from? So you can say, I have a couple of things I want to chat with you about. It's nothing urgent. I just want to find time. Would you rather talk for 15 minutes before bed, or do you want to talk over breakfast? That's a way to begin peacefully. R is relate to your child. Again, your child is going to be seeing this because they're separating from you, as they should. They might be a little suspicious. Why are you bringing this up? Do you think I'm doing something wrong? Are you worried about me or my friends? And so you want to put them at ease right away. So R in brief is relate to your child. And that can just sound like, you're not in trouble. I'm not worried. I'm just really curious about what you think about this topic, and I want to hear it from you. Or I remember that it was weird when my parents wanted to talk to me about this kind of thing. I'm going to do it pretty quickly. I'm going to try to make it not weird, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't. So that's a way to relate. I is interview for data. And that sounds clinical, and I want it to sound clinical. Your child is not going to relax if you've started peacefully, you related to them, and then you launch into, have you ever tried vape? Do any of your friends vape? I need their numbers if they do. We need to talk to their, if you go into this like a hard-hitting interview, your kid's going to freak out. So I want you to think of it more as you're gathering data on what your kid knows about this topic on a global level, not on a personal level, not what their friends are doing, but like if we're using vape, for example, what do you know about this? What do you know about what it does to your body? I'm curious if you're learning about this at school or if you've read anything about it. So that's how you do I, B-R-I. E is echo what you hear. That's Anybody who's seen a therapist on TV or been to one, you know what this sounds like. Oh, it sounds like you're saying this. That's really important because you want to show that you're listening. And it's also important because there's a lot of misunderstanding generationally between the way kids say things and the way we say things. So you're double checking there. And then F is the payoff. F is feedback. So you have really earned your way into your child's trust in communicating this way. And this is where you say, it's so great to hear what you've learned, what you know about this, what you think about this. I'd love to give you a few guidelines and suggestions that I think are going to be really useful to you here. And then give them one or two and then change the subject.
Awesome. These sound like great acronyms to remember when starting some of these conversations. And when we are trying to talk to our children about any topic, how do we define their way of communicating if we don't understand it or know it?
Well, I love that you asked that because a lot of parents don't realize that every kid has a different way of communicating. I know for a while that book, and I loved it, 5 Love Languages is really popular, and 5 Love Languages of Your Kids. I highly recommend it. There may be one, but I wish that there were one that were just about your child's style of communication. So some of your kids will tell you, I mean, they're just like great communicators, and they'll say, I like it when we talk. I don't like it when you say this. I like it when we cuddle, like whatever it is. And other kids won't. And I happen to have had one of each. So I'm experienced in different styles. And most of you, if you have more than one kid, have different communicators in your family. You're just going to go through trial and error, and you're going to be really flexible, and you're going to do a bunch of things. So maybe you're a big talker and your kid isn't. Try texting. For me, that was a game changer with my son, who was much more quiet than my daughter, who just like puked up her whole day as soon as she got in the door. I would give my son time, and I would send him a text, and I would say, I'd love to hear about the best and worst thing at school. Take your time, tell me tomorrow, but send me a text if you think of anything. That is a really good way to start. Some families do past journals. Some families communicate through doodles and drawings, or through a proxy. Another person can be really helpful, but you're just going to have to play around with it.
Yeah. Well, how do you feel about having forced time? So I know a lot of the time that we're able to have these communications, it's sad because we're just all so busy. You know, there's work, there's school, there's after school activities. And sometimes we attempt to force these conversations in the car and the dinner table, and they tend to pull away.
Yes, this is very common.
Yeah.
So I think we need to think about how we would feel, you know, if we really need to decompress, and our partner or our kid or our boss or our whoever, sister, is like, I need your attention right now and I need you to perform. That's really difficult. On the other hand, there is a balance between kids who are cocooning in their rooms all the time, and you're like, I gotta find time for this. So scheduling that first way to begin peacefully, I think is super helpful. No one likes to be dragged out of their comfort zone. So I think if you say, you know, let's talk Saturday, I'll take you to lunch, or we can walk the dog together. The shorter time frame you commit to, the better. And truly, these conversations should be 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and then you're done, and let your kid know that. Like, I only need 10 minutes. We can walk around the block 2 times, and then I'll be good. So I think that's good. I also think compromise, especially at an age when kids are starting to assert their own independence, can be really helpful. So you might say something like, I love that you love your room. I love that we've been able to create a space for you where you feel really safe and you can go relax and think deep thoughts and figure out who you are. Love it. Also, I love you and I miss you. And sometimes I need time with you because we're a family. And so let's figure out how to weave that in without taking away all of your room time.
It's definitely hard to fit everything in and everyone in. So I do agree. It's really important to find that balance of scheduling and organically just coming together. So now when we're having these conversations with them, and you know, they're hard-hitting conversations, normal day-to-day conversations, how do we know that our kids are effectively hearing us and that they're actively, you know, absorbing everything we're saying, even if they're not necessarily participating, we get those grunts and those nods, but how do we know that we're actually getting through to them?
I would say that grunts and nods mean that you are, right? If they're hearing you enough to have a little bit of a reaction, they're huffing and puffing, that means they've heard you. So that's not a bad thing. I wouldn't take offense to that unless it's extreme, but I probably would just be like, oh yeah, it sounds like you hear me, and maybe it's giving you something to think about. Maybe we can talk about it again next week after you sort of let it digest a little bit. That is a big part of these conversations with young kids, is giving them time to digest, because their brains are restructuring throughout adolescence in such a way that they are pulling on the emotional center of their brain, the amygdala, in the ways that they respond. And we see that they respond emotionally more often than calmly and reasonably. And that's just because the part of their brain that handles critical thinking and reasoning and problem solving is undergoing huge renovations during adolescence. It's going to be a really great brain once it gets done building. But until that, they're pulling on emotions. And so it's a little bit unfair, I think, to ask a kid to consider a new concept or a new thought you're proposing and have an immediate reaction. They're going to be impulsive and emotional about it. So as much as you can, I would say to your kid, I know I've given you a lot here to think about. Why don't you marinate on it for a little while and then let me know what you think at bedtime or tomorrow or whatever. I think that's fine.
And now with this, polite conversation that we're having where, they're listening, we're speaking, maybe we're getting a little bit back and forth. How do we connect more with our children on these topics, and even just, personally?
Yeah. So one thing that I find really helpful in terms of making a connection and not just sort of administering advice, because really the connection is what your kid's going to remember. They're going to remember that even more than the advice, right? And so when they need something from you in the future, if they feel you have that connection, they'll feel safe coming to you and asking, this happened at a party and I don't know what to make of it, or this is going on in my friend group and it's making me feel bad, right? So your job is to keep the door open. Your job isn't to have the perfect answer every time. There are a few little tweaks every parent can make to increase the chance that your kid will keep coming back. One is that brain restructuring that I was just talking about. Your kid is using the emotional center of their brain, the amygdala, to read your facial expressions, and it was not designed to do that. There was a very cool study that came out of Harvard's teaching hospital, and a neurologist put adults through an MRI and showed them people's faces and said, can you tell me what they're feeling just based on how they look? And adults got it right in this study every time. And teenagers got it wrong half of the time because they were using a different part of the brain to read facial expressions. So how many times have you said something to your child and you think it's an innocent question, like, oh, hey, how did your math? I always take my glasses off to show this. Like, oh, hey, how did your math test go? And you're making this face because for me, this is my like, I'm focused on your face or I'm paying attention. And your kid is like, we haven't even gotten the grade yet. I don't know why you're mad. And they stomp off. They're reading a scrunched forehead as anger, even when it's not. Even if you're like me and you're 49 and you just like have a scrunched forehead, it's going to read as anger. So my tip is to pretend you are a celebrity on a late night talk show who's gotten way too much Botox. And I call it having a Botox brow. And you basically want to keep your forehead neutral because kids can't read facial expressions well. So if you're going to feel robotic, your kid's going to love it. So if you say, how did your math test go? And your face is plain, you're going to get a much nicer response than if you're furrowed. So I won't talk for too long, but that's probably my solid gold hit for connecting better.
I like that. It's definitely something that everyone kind of does. And I think we need to control our facial expressions sometimes a little bit more with our kids, because I have to agree, there are a couple times where, I might have been doing something else and then I had a few minutes and I could, talk to them while they're at the table or something, and I don't realize that my face is still from over there.
That is such a good way of putting it. Your face is still from over there. And I'll tell you, I've had people send me emails saying we put this up in our law firm, this section of the book, because when we're talking to clients, you never know what your face is showing. Or people have said, I'm using this with my husband or my partner, and we're having more productive conversations. So not just for teens.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's something we need to be a little more aware of when we're coming in.
Yes, and it takes practice.
It does. So another thing, speaking of, being aware of our facials and, connecting, sometimes we have more than one child that is in totally different stages of their lives. Some are 4 years apart, 7 years apart. We have 3, 4, 5. How are we making sure that everyone is, connecting together as a family, and we're properly communicating with every single one at their stage that they're at?
Yeah. So I think that bringing that awareness to your family dynamic is important, because it's the opposite of saying, this is going to happen on my terms when I'm able to do it, and you guys just have to kind of fold in at whatever developmental stage you're at. It's recognizing that we have to, like I learned in teacher training, every child is different. And so what you plan for the day may get thrown out the window when you walk in the door, and it may work for kid A and it's never going to work for kid B. So you've got to really differentiate your approach, and you have to do that in your family too. You're just a little microcosm of a classroom, really. So a couple ways that you can be doing this. One is just practically speaking, finding time with each kid, which is hard because we're busy, but it doesn't have to be a ton of time. It just needs to be really focused time. If it's 5 minutes, if it's 15 minutes, 15 would be amazing. But if you have 4 kids, that's an hour that you're sort of divvying up in every day. So that can be direct one-to-one on text. It could be direct one-to-one prepping dinner or at bedtime, but to be able to say to the other kids, this is my time with so-and-so right now, because a lot of times families will have an encroacher who always wants to come in and be part of it. And you've got to respect that another kid needs your one-on-one time. So that's one way to look at it. And then another way to look at it is communally. Are there things that you can be doing as a group of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10, however big your family is, that engage everyone? And one of my favorites is this game that you play at dinner time, and it goes by a million different names. People call it Roses and Thorns, or Happy and Crappy, or you can Google so many funny names for this. And depending on the age of your kids, they can get a little bit more funny. But basically you go around the dinner table and you say, let's say it's Roses and Thorns. You say, what was one highlight of the day and what was one bad or thorny part of the day? And you keep it quick, but it's a really good way for everyone to be on the same sort of level, even though your kindergartner's rose might be, I got to, have a snack today that I really liked of gummies, and your 10th grader's rose might be completely different, So that's one that I like that's a bit more communal.
That is nice. Definitely gives everyone a chance to speak at
Yeah.
the table. So that's
Right.
always good to be able to include everyone. So we spoke a little bit about teaching, which brings us to it's our favorite time of the year, back to school.
Yeah.
We're, winding out of our summer brains and vibes and bringing back in a whole nother part of the schedule that we weren't ready for, which could lead to some anxiety, some, added stress. How do you suggest parents, bring up the topic of anxiety and stress, and making sure that, they their children feel comfortable bringing these feelings and emotions to somebody?
Yeah. Boy, anxiety is rampant right now. It really is, more than ever. So I think it's important that we start to begin teaching kids coping skills for dealing with anxiety well before we are in an anxious state, because it's really hard to learn when you are feeling anxiety. So I would say parents can easily, again, Google and look for some really simple things that you can teach your kid to deal with anxiety should it happen to crop up during the school day or right as you're trying to get them off to the bus and they're like, oh, I don't want to go. A couple things that I find to be really helpful. So getting into your body when you're feeling anxious is super helpful because anxiety affects the way your body reacts. It's creating a physical chemical reaction, shortness of breath or sweating or racing heart. And you've got to move your body to redirect that a little bit. That can be push-ups, that can be stretches, that can be jumping up and down, but some activity to release that. The other, of course, that we all know but rarely practice is breathing. And breathing is, breath control is such a good way to get into your body and away from your brain, which is telling your body, run, you're scared. You're freaked out by this. You don't know what school's going to be like. You don't know if you'll have friends this year, all this stuff. So teaching your kids like a simple boxed breathing, which is like breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, or it's something like that. Google box breathing, 4 seconds. And I would work with your kids, where we live, school was started yesterday. I know up in the north, people go after Labor Day. So wherever you are with school starting, it's a really good time to say, let's learn 1 or 2 quick things you could do should you ever get a little anxious, which is bound to happen. So that's a big thing. And then the counter to that is that anxiety grows the more attention we pay to it. So it's good to have these quick in and out exercises you can do to ground yourself when you're spiraling. It is not good to indulge every one of your child's anxious, nervous thoughts. There's a really terrific book by Don Huebner, and it's called What to Do When You Worry Too Much. And it's basically a cognitive behavioral therapy guide to dealing with anxiety. But one of the tricks that we used in my house and that I think is really helpful is to say, your anxiety is like a plant and it's going to grow every time we water it and pay it attention. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a worry box. And if you're worried about something, we're going to write it down so you don't forget and stick it in the box. And we talk about that at X time, after dinner every night or whenever you decide. 8:30 is the time. We talk for 30 minutes about the worry box and then we're done. And a lot of times what your kid has put into that box, by the time 8:30 rolls around, they're like, it was fine. It turned out fine. So, delaying it is another pretty helpful tactic.
How do you, approach, this, like, I don't want to say hands off, but kind of, this tactic to not give in to their anxiety, but also not feel like you're ignoring them because they then feel like, I hate to say that you don't care, but that you're not giving to the emotions that they need.
Well, they might feel that way, but it's sort of like you not giving in to them eating all the candy in the cupboard and them saying, you're not listening to me. This is what I want. And you're like, I get that. I love you. I care for you. You can't eat every piece of candy in the cupboard. We have to save some for later. And so we do it a lot as parents. We freak out about doing it around emotional stuff for that very reason that you mentioned. We don't want to look uncaring. So my advice, whenever you have this worry that comes into your head that says, well, I don't want to look like I don't care. I don't want my kid to think the door's not open. Be explicit. Say, I love you and I care for you. I am not telling you that I don't think we should talk about this. I do. If it's important to you, we should talk about it. But I don't want to grow this fear right now. And if I water this plant, it's going to grow. So we're just going to put it over here. And I promise you, I'm going to take good care of this box. And we're going to talk about these things later. And until then, let's do that breathing, or let's jump, or let's do push-ups, or this, or whatever you need to do to sort of calm that feeling down in your body. And we will discuss these things later, for sure.
Definitely. I think that's great advice to, help. I feel like our biggest thing as parents a lot is we get very judgmental on ourselves.
Yes.
So that we're not, conforming to this perfect parent. And if we're not, we're trying so hard. So we can't, like, the number one thing is I feel like we care too much if we're not giving enough.
That's right. And especially at the age when your child is starting to go through this individuation. So that, again, that's sort of typical around age 11. It could be a little bit earlier, it could be a little later in your house. But when they're starting to pull away, parents always say, what's the best thing I can do now that my kid is, growing up and starting to go, where I live, we call it middle school, but they're getting into these older grade levels. They're spending less time with me. What's the best thing I can do as a parent right now? And I always give the same advice, and it sounds a little bit like a joke, but I really mean it. The advice is get a hobby, because as your child is pulling away from you, you have this really incredible opportunity to show them that you are a fully rounded, interesting person with other hobbies and things that you put into your own self-care. And when your kid sees that, they're going to be like, such a relief. I don't have my mom or my dad on my shoulder all the time. And that frees me up to come to them and talk to them, because I know that the entire gravity of their day doesn't rest on how I did today. So if your kid comes home and the meaning of your life is asking them how their day was and you're grilling them, they're going to be like, this isn't right. But if you have a life that is full and interesting, your child will say, oh, it won't break my mom to hear about this because she's not resting all of her happiness on how I'm performing.
Definitely. And with that, is there any tips that you have for, encouraging independence and, branching out there and letting them, explore decisions on their own, but also letting them know that it's okay to ask for help and that the lines of communication are still open and that we're still here to support them with this balance of maybe not hovering, but still letting them know that we're here.
Yeah, I think, again, you can be explicit. And so I think it's important to just say what you mean with kids. We spend a lot of time, like you said, sort of worrying around in our own head. Will they think this? I hope they know I mean this. And when you say and feel those things inside your brain, it's perfectly appropriate to say those to your kids. I hope you feel that when I do this, it's coming from X, or that my hope is that you'll always feel comfortable coming to me. You also have to model that. You can't just say, I hope you always feel comfortable coming to me, and then yell when they come to you, right? Because they're going to get a real mixed message. And the message that's going to rise to the top there is, but when I come, you get really upset. So again, that sort of neutral expression when you talk is going to convey that. Saying it and following through. And then I think one way to ensure that you're creating that dynamic that you're looking for, where they know that they can come ask you for help, is if you ask them for help. So you can say, can I get your advice? I'm going through this thing at work where I feel like I keep, turning in my stuff and my boss is sort of blowing me off about this idea, this project I'm really excited about. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to approach it. You've been in school a long time. You've had teachers. What do you think is a good way? So, yeah, you don't really need their advice, but it's you might be surprised. You might get really, really good advice. What I think you're going to get is probably not great advice, but a super cute cheerleader who's going to be more invested in you as a whole person and be like, hey, tell me about that thing at work, which is amazing if your kid asks you about your work day, right? So I think that is a for sure thing. And then I think what you're also going to get is a child who understands that in this family, we help each other with problems. And I think that is a really great thing to start modeling from an early age.
I love that idea of family supporting each other,
Yeah.
and giving and receiving advice with this open line that we started. What is something, sometimes we don't give the best advice.
Right.
We hope that we hope that we're, giving everything that we've learned from experience and changing it for them. What are some things that you find helpful to do, when they come home and they say, your advice stinks, you
Right.
ruined my day,
This is such a good question. So what I will say is when you give advice, it's helpful again to ask, would you like my advice on this? What is more helpful in terms of being sort of preventative against your kids saying your advice stinks, I'm not coming back, and helpful in your child developing the part of their brain that becomes good at solving problems, is to brainstorm with them. So instead of categorically being like, I can't believe those friends have turned on you and they're not letting you sit with them in the cafeteria, here's what I need you to do. You're going to go to the guidance counselor and you're going to talk to her about it. And then when you get to school, I want you to find one of those friends and pull her aside and tell her you need her to save you a seat, right? May or may not be good advice, doesn't matter, because the result is if your kid does it and it doesn't work, then they're going to come to you, like you said, and be like, you give awful advice, I'm not coming back. They're probably not going to tell you. They're probably just not going to come back, honestly. So instead of doing that, if you can work on a list where you really encourage your child to come up with ideas, and the best way to do this is to say, what are the worst things that you could do? Let's figure those out first. Like, what would really blow this situation up? And so you start that way, because our best ideas are often locked behind our worst ideas, and we're our own worst critics. So when we brainstorm something, like, your brain almost very quickly, as soon as you come up with an idea, will go, that'll never work, that's dumb, right? And so start with the really dumb ones and get those out there, and begin that sort of stretching that muscle really gently that way. So together you could be like, what's the worst thing that you could do in this situation? And be funny about it if you want. Well, we could take eggs over to their house. Would that help? If we egged their house? Probably not. You could post something on social media about how they're behaving. Would that help? Think that through. Let's talk about how that would really pan out. So sort of explore with your kid, what are some things that wouldn't work? And then, all right, well, what are some things that might help? And think about, too, identifying how your child feels when they have a problem and solving for that feeling. If you try to solve for the way another kid is behaving, it's a very hard thing to fix. So if someone is being rude to your child at school, maybe with luck, they approach that kid and they say, I don't want you to speak to me that way anymore. I don't know, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But really what you can control and what you can fix is how your kid feels about it. So as you're talking to your child, I think it's helpful to say, how is this making you feel? Lonely, angry, resentful, jealous? Let's work on that. Because if it's lonely or jealous, maybe the answer isn't forcing those kids to let you sit there. Who wants to be around a bunch of people who don't want you there? Maybe the answer is reconnecting with another friend from earlier years who you sort of lost touch with, or joining a new activity. So I would say, this is a long answer, but to sort of guard yourself against that attack of you give bad advice, and even more so, to help your child develop the ability to solve their own problems. It's so important to brainstorm, and you can begin by doing that together.
Definitely. I think that's great advice, because it's hard sometimes to remember that we are creating we aid in the creation of how they handle their communication going forward.
That's right.
It's difficult. We don't want to, I try very hard not to make a miniature me.
Yes.
I say all the time. It's so funny when you see the way that they react to things and you're like, oh, that is me.
100%. They're like sponges, right?
Yeah.
So they absorb. I love that you said that. I try hard to not make a miniature me, because for a lot of parents, we think that's the goal, but it's not the goal. You don't want your child living with you when they're 30, right?
Correct. I mean, although there are days where I might love it, but
yes.
No.
We want a vacation together. We want a mountain home, and like we can all go there and spend time together. That's dreamy. But I also want them paying their own bills.
Definitely. And then real quick, I just want to go back to the brief model. If we go through, I believe it was the I.
Okay.
You said I stood for.
Yeah, so I is interview for data, and I said it sounds a little clinical, and I do want it to feel a little clinical, because what I don't want it to be is invasive. So so you've established a rapport. You've started off gently. Maybe you've scheduled a time. You've related to them. You've told them, you're not in trouble. I just want to talk about this. I know it's kind of weird to talk to your mom about these things, but we need to. I'll keep it quick. And then I is where you ask them questions. So like, I want to talk about friendships and just check in with you and see, we haven't talked about it in a while. And I want to know like who you're really loving hanging out with. If you go straight for the pain points during the I phase and your questions are about what's wrong, what's hurting, what's illegal, right? If you start going for like all those, I mean, we want to know those things, but those are even for a young person private, and they may be willing to share them with you, but not initially. So I'd like you to treat it more like, in the book, I describe it this way. I want you to pretend you are a DA on a case and you have nothing riding on this. You have no investment, no emotional investment. You're just kind of curious about the facts, right? So you can, another thing you can do is pretend you're talking to someone who isn't your child. A lot of times we get so emotionally entangled, but if you're talking to your kid's best friend or your niece or a neighbor down the street, you often have more productive conversations, So you can think of it that way too. And then ask questions that are a little less invasive. You might get to the point where your kid is on a roll and they're telling you things, and that's wonderful, but it doesn't start there. So begin by being a little bit more generic and broad in what you're asking.
And before we start Q&A, I just have one more thing that I wanted to ask. What do you feel is the most important, emotion, feeling, or conversation that every parent needs to have with their kid?
So if it's an emotion or a feeling, I think it's twofold. I think it's, I'm on your team. And even though it might feel sometimes like we're seeing things differently, my bottom line is I love and support you, even when we see things differently. So I think that's really huge. And the other one, I think it was Maya Angelou or Toni Morrison. Now I can't remember, but one of my favorite authors said they at some point discovered that the key to happiness in their home was that when their child walked into the room, they lit up with joy at seeing their child. They wanted their kid to see joy on their face when their child entered, not, have you done your homework? Why are you coming in now? I thought you were doing blah, 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 right? Not concern, not a question or a worry, just joy. It's you, a person I love. I'm happy to see you. So I think that is really good. And then if there's one conversation, like of these 14 that I want you to have, I want you to have them all. I really want you to have the easy, fun ones where you're connecting and laughing and having fun. But I mean, I really want you to have the hardest conversation of all. I want you to talk about self-care and self-harm and suicide with your children when they are young, so that they know they can come to you if they or a friend are suffering.
Those are difficult, and
yeah,
they're going to be difficult, but it's the difficult conversations that we all really need to have.
And you'll be so glad you did. Your child wants to talk about these things. They really, really do. I mean, there's research. It's not just me saying this. Research backs it up. They want more conversations with you. They don't want to feel judged during the conversation, but they really want the conversation.
Amazing. All right, so we're going to open the Q&A portion of our time today, and we already have some amazing questions coming in. Our first one is from Melanie. Melanie is a grandparent, and she sees that her daughter-in-law's anxiety spills over into her children, but she won't talk about it with her son or anybody else. The kids are all experiencing high levels of anxiety. How can she help without being intrusive or making things worse?
Oh, this is such a good question, because she said daughter-in-law, not daughter. So we have an extra layer of complexity here in family dynamic, and I don't know what their relationship is like. And I don't know if the daughter-in-law admits to anxiety or if she's just so embroiled in it, she can't see it. So this is a tough one. What I would say is, as a grandparent to the younger kids, you have a more direct line in a way, even if it's the mother who is sort of generating this feeling of anxiety. And so what I would say to this grandparent is leave the family dynamic out of it and just teach your grandkids a couple things that they can do to manage anxiety. Do those breathing techniques with them. If you're over Zoom, do them together. If you're in the same room, you can do a little meditation thing together. You can suggest some cool apps that they can download. But if they can begin on their own, independent of how their mom is handling her emotions, to sort of manage that feeling, I think it'll be a lifelong gift to them. But it feels to me, I'm not a family therapist, and I feel like I'm sort of speaking in that tone right now. So you might want to ask one. But it feels to me like involving the daughter-in-law gets tricky. So I think I would just be like, as a grandparent, I value these tips and techniques, and I'm going to teach them to you because I love you.
That is great advice. Our next question comes in from Anonymous. Now, this is one of our tough conversations.
Okay.
How do you communicate with your child when they want to be addressed as they? You're constantly slipping up, calling him he or she. They feel like you are disrespecting them, but it's a hard change when you've called them a certain pronoun for over 10 years or more, especially since it's not something you are familiar with or have grown up with.
I think this is a thoughtful question. I hear this from a lot of parents who recognize the importance, and it is of huge importance to your child's mental and physical health that you do recognize that this is how they want to be addressed. So they recognize that, and they are with an open heart trying, but habits are habits. And so it's really easy to slip and use a former pronoun. I'm sorry that the child is seeing that as disrespect. I think you might just have to be wholeheartedly saying to them, I am really trying. I want this for you, and I want this for me. And I'm going to keep trying, and please don't give up on me while I work really hard to make this the first thing I say, they, instead of he or she or whatever it may be. So you may have to just ask for a little bit more grace and make sure that you, when you do that, that you are doing what you say you're doing, that you're really giving it your best effort, and that you're not, when you slip up, you're not saying, well, what do you expect? It's hard, it's a habit. When you slip up, you say, I'm sorry, I did it again. I'm gonna keep trying. Please stick with me while I try, right? So that would be my advice there.
Our next one comes in from Anonymous. I struggle connecting with my 13-year-old daughter. I feel she thinks that I'm just a dumb dad. I'm not looking to be her friend necessarily, but I want to connect with her and have a great father-daughter relationship. Any tips?
I think that's so sweet. And I think the key at this age, well, she may be doing the dumb dad thing because it is a little bit sort of sitcom-y and commercially to do that. So I think kids live a little bit what they consume in the media. And the dumb dad is a real trope. So it's like the, tripping down the stairs, buffoonery, can't get anything right. And that's a big thing culturally right now. So rather than talking to her about her reaction to you, it might be interesting if you were watching a show and you brought it up that way, because it's less of a personal attack on how she's treating you or condemnation, and more of a curiosity, like, what is it with this trope of dads being portrayed like they're just idiots and they can't be good parents? It's so weird to me. Do you see that? Like, what shows have these dumb dad characters? And maybe that's a dinner conversation for the whole family. And you can, just say you heard something about it today and you wanted to talk about it. So I would bring it up a little bit more organically that way, as sort of like, what's going on with the culture, folks? And then you might be able to segue that into, when she rolls her eyes at something you say, you can be like, am I the dumb dad trope right now? Ugh, like, I guess it's happening, and joke it off a little bit and see what she says. And then my other piece of advice is to engage with her on what she's into. And it sounds like you're probably very interested in doing that and may already be doing that. But if her thing is watching YouTube videos or, TikToks about makeup or whatever, I would get into that with her. And then I would also ask her to watch some things you're interested in and explain that to her, what you like about it, and sort of develop the sort of camaraderie that way. That is not loosening any of the parental boundaries. It's just sort of tightening your relationship.
I think that goes back to our hobbies. Finding a common hobby, I feel.
Yes. That's great.
We had another question from Martin. I'm a poor communicator. Any advice on techniques?
I mean, that's broad. So I would say I applaud you, Martin, for feeling that this is an area that you can improve upon. Not knowing why or how you're a poor communicator, I'm not sure I can be super specific with you, but I will say the best thing that you can do as a good communicator is be a good listener. So that's where I would focus your attention. I would be a listener who's an active listener. So a lot of parents listen, and I'm going to casually toss my husband under the bus. So he knows about this. We've talked about this at home. We love to text in our family, and my kids are older now. So we have a group family text, and we send things around that are funny or informative or what's going on in our lives. And it's great. And a lot of times days later, I'll say to my husband, did you see the thing about whatever? And he'll say, yeah. And I'll be like, well, you have to like it or, or somehow let us know. Otherwise, he's like, oh, I think I responded in my head. And that's the thing. So make sure that you may think I'm listening and I'm doing a really good job of it. But if the other person doesn't hear some validation and know that they're heard, it doesn't matter in a way. So I guess that's my tip for where to start. Not knowing exactly what you're experiencing, I would say, make sure you're listening and saying, I hear that, that makes sense. I'm sorry about that. Can I offer any help? Those kinds of things, so the person knows that you really did hear.
So we had another question come in. I have two teens, 15 and 16, and it seems that when we talk, it's always defensive conversation. How do I, change the vibe as well as make it that everyone is being listened to?
Okay, well, do that Botox brow for sure. Because I have a feeling that once you look neutral, your kids are going to realize something different is happening. And it may take a few times. So practice that. And the other thing is, this doesn't have to be a magic trick happening behind a curtain. You can tell them, I saw this woman today and she told me about this thing. And it sort of opened up my mind to maybe this is happening here. Do you sometimes think I'm mad when I don't think I'm mad? And talk to them about that, and talk about this cool experiment where people are using different parts of their face, their brains to read facial expressions. So say, if this is happening with us and you think I'm mad, will you ask me? And I'll tell you, I'm probably not, I might be, but I'll just let you know, I just don't want us to miscommunicate around that. So I would start there. And then, I think you look at your own kind of role in this. And then if it's happening that your kids are just explosive and they have that teen boy energy, you can just say to them, I feel like you're upset with me and I'd love to keep talking. I don't really know how to respond to that. Let me take a little time, and model that you are really chill and you want to come back to this, but you need to take a minute. Let's put a pin in this, get a snack, whatever. And let's come back to this in a few minutes because it's really important, but I don't want us to be upset.
And do you have any tips for, what you call that Botox brow or controlling that face? Because like I said, it's hard, and sometimes
it's really hard. Yeah. So your kid will tell you, if you tell them about this tip, your kid will say you're doing that thing with your face. And so that's helpful. Then you can just be like, I'm sorry. So one thing that I started doing, I have been doing this work now for almost 18 years. And so one of the things that I started doing early on when my kids were in middle school was ironing out my face. I would just put my hands up here and do this before I knew we were going to talk about stuff, or if I felt I was getting a little bit riled up. So you can do that. You could take a deep breath. Your child does not need an immediate response from you to their very impulsive brain. So you can buy yourself time and you can just say, I want to think about this because I want to give you the best answer I can. So let me just take a beat.
Awesome. And we have time for one more question.
Okay.
How do we help our children stay safe online when they are not sharing with us what happens in that world?
Yeah, it's a huge one. I mean, this could be its own entire seminar. So what I'll say is, um, depending on the age of your child, the way that I think about technology is that as a tool like any other tool, it can be super helpful. No tool can be helpful to us without it also being dangerous. That's how I explain it to kids. So a knife is amazing. It helps us cook. You can also cut your finger in the kitchen. A stove is fantastic. It heats up enough, again, to cook, 2 cooking ones, but doesn't matter. Hammer, whatever tool you pick, cannot be helpful without being dangerous. Technology is the same way. So for younger kids, you do monitor. And as your kid gets older, they're using knives in the kitchen without you watching. They're going online without you watching. The best thing you can do, since you cannot see it all the older your kid gets, is you build in them a strong set of values that relate between the online world and their real life. And there is a chapter in the book that talks about having a family conversation about what your relationship with technology would look like. So I think that would be particularly helpful as you're navigating this.
Thank you. And from that, we are going to segue into sharing a slide of your book and where to get it.
Great.
And that is 14 Talks by Age 14. And that can be purchased at
While you're pulling that up, I'll tell you a fun fact I just learned. This book is in the top 10 books of longest hold times at the library. So your library should have it, but you want to get in line early, or you can really get it at all your favorite indie bookstores or online bookstores too, if you want your own. Or Audible, I read it. With my non-allergy voice, I read it.
Thank you, Emily. Emily added into the chat your website, where to purchase your book, and as well as your Facebook group, and other online resources that you've posted.
Terrific. Thank you. I would love to see you all over on the socials.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for this great conversation today. And before we sign off, we just want to remind you that we have a organizer Discord community for all of our organizers to join, as well as our Keep Connected podcast, which also has other great interviews and conversation. So thanks again, Michelle, so much for joining us today. And I feel like we learned so many great communication tips and so many things I can't wait to try it in my own home.
Thank you, Ashley, and thanks to everyone who joined in and asked questions. And it was great to spend the hour with you.
Thanks.